Welcome indeed. Let's get to our morning keynote now. We're very pleased to have with us a great mind in this area. Peter Schwartz is Senior VP of Strategic Planning for Salesforce. He's got some thoughts on where all this will lead down the road. What are some of the outcomes of connected and autonomy as we play them out to some of their very interesting future definitions and outcomes? Please welcome Peter Schwartz.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. This is something that excites me a lot. I'm a car guy. I'm electronics. I'm high tech. I love this kind of stuff. I've been playing with it for over 40 years. And I've been thinking about this question of the connected car and the future of the automobile for quite a long time. I've had the pleasure of having the opportunity here in Los Angeles to help write several movies. Among those films is a film some of you may have seen a few years ago called Minority Report. And in that, we actually showed for the first time a variety of transportation options. Now, the first of those transportation options we showed was this.
Fire 'em up!
Hey, John.
So
That was a rough one.
I can tell you, you won't be getting Jetpack soon. The truth is, Steven Spielberg made these movies, and I told Steven when we made the film, you know, jetpacks violate the laws of physics, can't have it, but if you're Steven Spielberg, you get to violate the laws of physics, right? And if you're the director, you make that call. Your technical advisor doesn't make the call. On the other hand, we did show this. So these were all connected cars and actually going vertical. Steven said, we're not going to have any traffic jams in my future. So we said, well, the only way to avoid that is we go vertical. So I've been thinking about the future of the car and actually trying to show what the world what it might be like for quite a long time. But the truth of the matter is that it really requires some fairly rigorous thought to try to think about where this is all going over the next 20, 30 years. And you know, the problem of thinking about new technology is really a great challenge. And I'm going to show you a slide that is probably the single most costly slide in business history. Not to make, but the cost of the decision that was made with it. So it is this graph here. And the reason it looks kind of funky is that this is an actual picture of an overhead transparency. Some of you are old enough to remember when we used to use overheads, right? And this is an actual picture of an overhead transparency that was given to me by IBM. These are the forecasts that was used by IBM to make the decision about a new product called the personal computer in 1980. And this was their forecast for total sales. And I'm not sure you can read the number there, but you can see it's 241,000 units over 5 years. They quickly did, and by the way, of course, it peaks in 1983 and goes south because nobody would buy a second one because it's so useless, right? It's a fad, obviously going to come and go. This thing doesn't really have much of a future. So, in fact, they said, well, you know, why bother developing the operating system? There's this kid from Seattle, Gates or something, and he's got this operating system, QDOS, and we'll take it for free. He's giving it to us for free. We'll put it on it, and we'll buy the chips from Intel, and we'll put it in an IBM box, and we'll call it an IBM PC. And not realizing, of course, that in that very moment they gave away control. They gave away completely the future of the personal computer business because they didn't really understand the industry. They didn't see where it was going. Now, were these men stupid? And ladies, they were all men in the room. So, you know, if there had been maybe some women, somebody might have challenged it, but nobody did. This was a male decision, and they all said, nah, this isn't really going anywhere in a very big way. and they didn't invest behind it in the way that they should have and actually control the future. Now, even more behind this is that this actually set in motion a great structural change in the industry. And ultimately, IBM became a service company, not just a hardware company. Today, its business model has evolved. And I think there's a message in both of these for the car companies. Trying to understand, and the electronics industry, how this will play out is a challenge. And it won't be just simply sticking more stuff into the car and connecting it. The very business model of how we do business, who leads change, who are the winners and losers in this industry, is also up for grabs in this change. Because this is part of a period of change that is, I think, really enormous in the automotive industry. Several really big changes are happening simultaneously, of which this is one, not the only environment. So there's a lot to be learned from the IBM experience. So let's just go quickly through. I think it's a very familiar list to all of you of what's actually going on in the background of this change. I mean, first of all, there's obviously much greater complexity in the car, in the ecosystem, in the value chain, many more players connecting in lots of new ways. Regulation is going up on safety and the environment. Sustainability is an issue all over the world. We're concerned about climate change, emissions, all that sort of thing, and safety all over the world, and sustainable mobility, traffic jams. You know, anybody who has been to Bangkok or Beijing or Shanghai or Delhi knows what traffic jams look like these days, and they're immobile in so many different places. Another of the big changes that's happening simultaneously with the movement toward connected cars is electrification. That is more and more electricity in the drivetrain in a variety of ways, whether it's electric cars or hybrids or hydrogens or fuel cells. New forms of powertrains also shifting fundamentally. And there's something else going on, and Brian touched on it. More and more people are experiencing that world of essentially intelligent context delivered to them in a variety of situations through intimate computing. And Brian, you used the word intimacy, and I think that's exactly right. The environment will know you in ways that it hasn't before. And so what they're experiencing this when they walk into the shop, when they go to school, when they deal with government services, and so on. And that continuous experience, I think, will be part of what they are experiencing. Furthermore, what we're seeing is that the biggest growth in the marketplace is in emerging markets. You know, volumes have begun to slow down in Europe, United States, and so on. This has to do with the maturing and aging of our societies. But in China, in India, in Latin America, and other parts of the world, they're still growing rather dramatically, and everybody still wants cars. So an enormous amount of growth in emerging markets. And so what's beginning here will eventually get there as well. And one of the important questions and uncertainties is how quickly. And what we're talking about here today are several different markets. There are really two completely different markets out there for cars. The first are car enthusiasts, people who love the experience of driving. Their cars are a statement of identity. It's like clothing. It makes a statement of who you are and what kind of person you are. And you love being behind the wheel and getting somewhere and enjoying the experience. And then there's other people for whom it's simply a matter of getting there. It's transport. They want the cheapest, best, most affordable, most safe, most reliable transport to get from here to there. And the experience is about to diverge for those two kinds of markets. We've had basically one kind of market in the past, you know, kind of lower-end cars for people who didn't care very much, and higher-end, more high-performance cars for people who cared. But in fact, we're about to see a big split in this marketplace, going in two very different directions. Another key element of this, and this goes to who are the winners and losers, are basically what we're going to see is because so much of the innovation is coming from the supply industry, more and more of the value is coming out of the suppliers to the auto industry. And then finally, if we start thinking about connectivity, one of the places we tend not to pay much attention to, because we're all thinking about individual cars, is the fleets. And an enormous fraction of cars are sold into fleets, and those fleets have very high value for connectivity, whether they're business fleets or rental fleets, so on. There's an enormous value in the connectivity and the data associated with that. And fleet sales may drive some of the early developments in connectivity in a large-scale way. So, what are the technologies? Well, we talked about at the kind of macro level, Brian laid out what are the broad technologies, but what we're seeing here is, first of all, much greater bandwidth to the car. We're about to move to 5G. A lot of people don't even have 4G yet, but I just saw the first demonstrations of gigabit networks in Singapore with 5G networks. So you start thinking about what it means when you have 5G coming to the car instead of 4G. You have much higher bandwidth and what you can do with that. Much more computational power on board. You talked about the smartphone, Brian. You think about the smartphone of today. 5 years from now, this will have 3 orders of magnitude more computing power. I was an engineer on the Apollo. I worked on the Apollo capsule. This thing has 10 orders of magnitude more computing power than we had on the Apollo capsule. Already this device does. So in a few years, you will have a supercomputer in your pocket and a supercomputer in the car interacting together. Lots of new interfaces, voice especially. One of the important things that's happening is that we're actually beginning to move into the era of voice commands and voice interaction. The Siri so far is kind of funky. Apple didn't actually do the right thing with Siri. It was designed for specialized languages, not generalized languages. It's not too great, actually, for saying, so, you know, what do you think is the best book I ought to read on the subject of connected cars? Not too good on that. But if you ask, you know, where is the nearest Best Buy, it's pretty good on that. So it is, in fact, a very limited vocabulary, and you can design it for the automobile in such a way that it also has a limited syntax, limited vocabulary, and from that point of view, it will work extremely well. So what we're going to see is the interfaces using voice. Lots of sensors on board and in the environment. So the car will be full of sensors of all sorts for performance, et cetera. But the environment will have lots of sensors that will interact with the car, providing information of a variety of sorts, including, critically, vehicle to vehicle. So you will know everything about the vehicles around you. Your car will know. You won't even have to think about it. We're just setting the standards now for vehicle-to-vehicle communication. And one of the important things is for driverless cars, you have to know where all the other cars around you are. And that's how we're going to achieve it in a relatively simple way with direct communication between the cars. And these cars are always going to be connected to the cloud. I'm from a cloud company. The cloud will be everywhere. There'll be high clouds, low clouds, clouds everywhere. And all that data will be accessible anytime, any place, in real time. And then finally, you know, we think about social networks of people sharing information and collaborating in lots of ways. Well, we'll have social networks of cars. The cars will be communicating and collaborating. It'll be the intelligence of the fleet, not just the intelligence of the crowd, providing kind of aggregate performance data, et cetera. So these are some of the kinds of technologies that we're likely to see. Now, earlier I said that we're talking about 2 different kinds of car buyers. And what we see here, this is from McKinsey, are the upper part of this are basically the people who love driving, right? The lower part are the ones of the people who just want to get there. And it's roughly 50-50. And so what's going to happen is for those of us who actually really love driving, and I have a BMW Z4 that I love, and it's unapologetic yellow, I call it. It's a lot of fun. My wife drives a BMW i3, the new i3, because she likes to just get there. She's very clean and green, and it's very safe. It's pretty fun to drive, but it's not as fun as my Z4, right? And we represent the 2 different kind of drivers. She could care less, frankly, and she wants a clean, green, safe car. And that is about half the market. And they are the market for the connected car. They're the people who, they're for the driverless car. Now, in fact, on Thursday night, I was down at Google riding in their driverless car, and it's a really cool experience, you know, riding around the neighborhood with nobody in the driver's seat, right? It's kind of weird. But if you haven't tried it, it's worth doing. And it gives you a sense of what is coming. We're not there yet. You know, there's a lot more that has to happen. But over time, what we're going to find in more and more places is that possibility will exist. And it'll exist for those people who don't really care about driving very much. And for a very long time, we're going to be in this world of 2 different kinds of markets. It may happen, we'll come to it, that eventually it'll be all driverless cars, and cars will be seen like we see horses today, right? You know, people still love horses, and they go out and ride in, you know, parks and riding rings and so on. And people will drive their cars in places where it will be acceptable to drive cars. Most of us will run around in driverless cars. That's a long way off. That vision is a long way off, if ever. But for quite a long time, we're going to see more and more people going down the freeway with nobody having their hands on the wheels. And so we're going to see that divergence in the marketplace beginning to develop. Now, this is, in fact, that customer for transport. They're using Uber, they're using Lyft, they're using Zipcar, because Zipcar represents another one of the models for the people who don't really care very much about cars, but are principally interested in transport. And they now have the possibility of essentially calling up a car and having it arrive. They also have the possibility of picking up a car whenever they want to use it in the form of Zipcar and others like it. So most of the near-term applications are already locked in. We've already talked about the two different markets. We're talking about the increasing value in the suppliers to OEMs and the fleets having huge value in connectivity. So most of that is still locked in. The driverless car, this was the Prius. We're going to see more and more of these, more brands coming out with them, more of the OEMs. And what we're going to see here is now the real challenge is who are going to be the winners and losers. And so what you see in every stage of the value chain is there's the opportunity to participate. And this represents, it seems to be, a big challenge for the OEMs, for the big car makers. Because, of course, they're basically mechanical engineers mostly, involved in a product that is driven by engineering and manufacturing and high volume production. In a world where a lot of the innovation is coming from electronics and software. The Tesla is often described as a PC on wheels. Because it's got an enormous amount of computing power and that great big screen in the middle. And that gives you a sense of where a lot of the innovation is going to come from. So one of the big challenges from the point of view of the traditional manufacturers is how do they play in it? Are they going to give away all the value to the suppliers and the electronics companies and the software developers? Or are they going to capture a big hunk of that value themselves? For that to happen, they're going to have to change and adapt. And that's where the IBM example becomes apt. Are they going to be able to adapt as IBM successfully did? But it required a wholesale change in their business model, leadership, et cetera, for them to be able to do that. So it will be with the OEMs. Are they able to make that change or not? If yes, then it's a different world. If not, then all of that innovation is going to move out of their hands and they will be just basically hardware suppliers to a software industry. So what are the big uncertainties? How does the technology actually play out and what's the experience of it? What are the big architectural choices that people make? People have made wrong choices in the past. Some of you will remember ISDN, the phone companies invested in significantly. If you are French, you may remember Minitel. Their version of telecommunications and electronics in the 80s and so on didn't go anywhere. And so, those kinds of choices can be made. What do customers actually do with it? How's the acceptance? And finally, where does that value accrue? So, as was said, I do scenario planning. And if you think about scenarios, you can think about it in terms of a matrix. And the matrix basically has two fundamental dimensions of uncertainty. What's the level of connectivity? Are the cars really hyper-connected and connected as densely and richly as possible? Or are they really minimally connected? This just doesn't really take off for a variety of reasons. And we maintain where we are, but we don't go nearly as far and as fast as we might imagine. And then finally, where's the value captured? Mostly by the suppliers or mostly by the OEMs? And with that, you can see four different possible scenarios. The first of which I called the digital OEMs. And this is the dream of Ford and Chrysler and GM and Toyota and BMW and so on. This is where there's essentially enormous amount of value accruing in the auto industry from cars that are hyper-connected and where people really love the services that connectivity brings. This is the world in which you have an enormously rich environment. The vision that you showed, the people riding around in Switzerland in that car with video, et cetera, all the kinds of things that connectivity might bring. An enormous amount of information about the car to the dealer, to the manufacturer, et cetera, and vice versa, information back to the consumer, the rider in the car. And this movement leads to all of the advanced technologies of connection happening relatively quickly. Now, beyond 10 years, you start beginning to see driverless cars increasingly common in this scenario, where you see in particularly some cities, places like Singapore, Shanghai, Beijing, maybe New York, where you're going to see significant advances in the driverless car. And what you see then is the ecosystem of companies involved in providing the services and capabilities to support that, really shaped by the OEMs, who really adapt to this new world. And finally, you begin to see a lot of the movement in emerging markets. Some of the leading cities that I've already mentioned are some of the earliest participants in this. So this is the big vision of what the connected car, the driverless car, driven by today's auto industry leaders might look like. On the other hand, we might see a lot of the value developing, but in fact, it ends up in the hands of the suppliers who really shape it. This is the world of the IBM and PC repeated, as it were. It ends up in all of the companies like Microsoft and Intel and all the others out there who actually are the ones who, in fact, provide the technologies. This is a world of a fragmented ecosystem because nobody's providing the integrated architectures, so it slows adoption. We can all remember what it was like in a world where things didn't communicate very well. And we had to, you know, when I started traveling with PC, I had all kinds of different connections for different phone networks and for different acoustic couplers and all that kind of stuff to get on board. Well, that's what it will feel like, a bit kludgy in this scenario because we don't have an integrated architecture. So people will want the product, but they're frustrated by compatibility issues. You know, you take your device from one car to the next and it doesn't connect, your profile doesn't follow you, and it just doesn't quite work, and you're kind of trapped into different ecosystems. And as a result, the driverless cars are a bit slower to develop, and they're mostly in just a very few cities, not a kind of global phenomenon. So this is the scenario we call digital invaders, where the essentially supply industry really takes over the world of the auto industry. Now, you know, not everything has worked. Not all these technologies have always taken off. There's a lot of dead technologies we have seen in the past. Any of you have an 8-track still set of cassette players? There's a lot of technologies that we were very hopeful for, and they never came to pass. So on the one hand, we might say the consumers don't get excited about it. Privacy concerns, for example, might raise big concerns for some players, as you wind up with them not taking it nearly as seriously. You might have a big accident. Say you have driverless cars or people not paying attention, watching the ads on the screen, and suddenly there's a big scandal that hits. And what happens is a shattering of trust. And that leads to a minimal use of connectivity. And so that it really slows things down enormously. It leads to tougher regulation that slows the pace of innovation. And in this scenario, this is where the OEMs change in advance, and they buy a lot of companies, they acquire things, but they lead to costly failures. This is where a lot of the money goes down the tubes and doesn't really yield much. And you end up with driverless cars being a specialty niche in a few cities. And as a result, you wind up with emerging markets being very slow to adopt the new technology. And then the final scenario is what I call digital retreat. Here is the OEMs didn't adapt, and by the way, it turns out to be in their interest because, of course, it doesn't really play out. So most of the startups in connectivity tend to fail. Most of the little companies that are hoping to be part of this ecosystem as data suppliers, as hardware suppliers, as service suppliers, don't really make it. Privacy issues get to be a big issue. This goes out of fashion as a target for VCs, so you don't see a lot of capital coming in. And you all remember the paperless office, right? You all have one, right? There's no paper piling up on your desks anywhere. All right, well, of course, this is the world of the paperless office, too. This is the connected car that didn't happen. Remember teleconferencing from home? We were all going to stay home and not travel to work. Well, that didn't happen either. We all have Skype and all that stuff, and we hardly ever use it. So it doesn't take off. And you get very few driverless cars happening. You have it in places where you can actually have state-driven projects, like a few Chinese cities. So this is the ultimate negative scenario. Now, I happen to think that the first two scenarios are actually quite likely, but we have to take into account the likelihood that it may not all play out the way we think it might. So let me conclude with what I think are the central challenges. Consumer acceptance. How will consumers react to the new technology? Will they value it and trust it? If they value it and trust it, that's critical, and then it'll take off. Secondly, organization and culture. Will the OEMs actually be able to adapt or not? Or is this going to be a game for most everybody else, and they are takers, not players? And then finally, what's the industry structure? Where does it really capture the value? Is it in the world of the OEMs, or is it in the world of the supplier industry? So there's plenty of opportunity in this world, but a lot of uncertainty, I think, yet. As I said, I'm very enthusiastic. I tend to think that it'll be the first of those two. But if you're a business decision maker, you have to think about all the possible scenarios. Thank you very much.